Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a really interesting academic paper that looks at the legendary medieval warrior Saladin and says he had a secret blueprint for winning. And here's the twist. It had almost nothing to do with his sword. Yeah, we all have this image of Saladin, right? The great general. But get this. Right after his biggest victory ever, retaking Jerusalem in 1187, he said this. He gave the credit not to his army, but to the pen of his chief advisor, a man known as the virtuous judge. So what on earth did he mean by that? Well, that one surprising quote, it's pretty much the key to this whole paper. It suggests Saladin's victories weren't just about military might. They were built on something totally different, a foundation that the paper calls the knowledge-based model. Okay, so knowledge-based models sounds a bit academic, right? But it boils down to something really simple. You have to get your own house in order before you take on the guy next door. It's all about unifying your internal front, making sure everyone is on the same page, and securing your base first. Only then do you even think about fighting an external enemy. Right, so according to this paper, Saladin wasn't some hothead just rushing into battle against the Crusaders. No way. He was playing chess, not checkers. He was playing the long game. And if you actually look at the timeline of his career, you can see this model play out, step by step. You can see it's this super deliberate process. First things first, he spends years just consolidating his power in Egypt, making it his fortress. Then, and only then, he moves into Syria, not to fight the Crusaders, but to unite all the different Muslim groups who are constantly fighting each other. And it was only after all that was finally done, and get this, we're talking nearly 17 years later, that he finally turned his full military power against the Crusader states. And this is where it gets really, really interesting, because the paper actually crunched the numbers, and what it found is pretty staggering. Saladin spent almost 3 times as much of his energy just unifying his own side as he did fighting his main enemy, the Crusaders. Just let that sink in for a second.
Let's put a hard number on it. We're talking about 75%. Roughly 3/4 of his entire effort went into dealing with internal problems. Putting down rebellions, handling rival warlords, and even dealing with other Muslim rulers who were, believe it or not, collaborating with the Crusaders.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's that Saladin saw a direct link between the Crusaders' strength and Muslim disunity. His big aha moment was realizing that the external threat wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the weakness within. If you could fix that, the external threat would become a whole lot easier to handle. All right, so that's the historical model. Makes sense, right? But this is where the paper takes a pretty bold leap. The author, Abdel el-Fattah el-Awazi, takes this 12th century blueprint and argues that we can use it as a lens to understand the Middle East right now, today. Okay, so just a quick and important note here before we dive into this next part. What we're about to go through is the author's direct application of this model. We're here to explain the paper's analysis, to show you how he maps this historical model onto the modern world. We are presenting it neutrally, just as it is in the source. And this table really gets to the heart of his argument. You can see he draws a one-to-one parallel. On one side, you have the 12th century, with the Crusader states as the external force. On the other, the contemporary parallel he proposes is the US, in what the paper calls its buffer state/Israel. And those internal rivals Saladin had to deal with? He equates them with regional regimes aligned with the US today. So, according to this model, the logic is that the external power isn't standing on its own. It's being propped up, or at least supported by, these internal regional actors. It's the same dynamic, the paper argues, as when the Crusader states got help from Saladin's rivals. And if that's true, it means that any strategy for change has to focus on the internal situation first, just like Saladin did. Okay, so if you take that parallel and follow it all the way through, the paper does something more than just analyze the situation. It actually proposes a solution. It lays out a whole strategic roadmap for the future that's built piece by piece on Saladin's old model. The whole strategy rests on 3 central ideas. First, the paper argues the conflict is being managed by the US for its own interests. Second, the people who are right there in the first circle, the Holy Land, they're seen as the spearhead of the whole thing. But, and this is the big one, the third point is that they can't do it alone. The task is just too big. It requires the second circle, which is places like Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and even a third circle like Iraq and Turkey. So from those 3 core ideas, the author proposes a 3-step strategy. And you'll see it sounds a lot like Saladin's playbook. Step 1 is to focus on liberating the key surrounding regions first, those second and third circles. Step 2 is to get the people in those regions involved, mobilized for the cause, not just with money, but intellectually and politically. And then finally, step 3 is to engage on a global level, building support from people all over the world. And really, that's the whole thing in a nutshell. It's Saladin's model, pulled from the 12th century and dropped into the 21st. The core message is exactly the same. Unite and secure your own house before you even think about confronting the threat on your doorstep. It's all about putting the internal front first. It's a really fascinating way of using history, isn't it? Not just as a story of the past, but as a potential framework for understanding the present. And that kind of leaves us with a bigger question to chew on. What other historical models or forgotten strategies might be out there, just waiting to give us some surprising insights into the world we live in today?